In this lecture, we're going to talk about Mendel and pedigrees. As we've mentioned before, Gregor Mendel is considered kind of the father of modern genetics. He was a monk from Austria, and he developed the rules that predicted heredity when he was working in a monastery, and he did a lot of growing of plants, including peas, and that was what he used as his research subject. He looked at how the traits from the pea plants, whether it was the pod color or the seed shape or the flower color, he looked at all those traits and he would breed plants to find out how they were passed from the parent plant to the offspring plant. So he looked at lots of different traits, including like the seed shape, flower color, the pod shape, pod color, the stems, and he discovered which of those traits were considered dominant traits and recessive traits. We've talked about these before, but he is the person who first described the law of segregation, which means that two alleles for a trait separate during gamete formation. He also discovered the law of independent assortment, which says that the alleles of different genes separate independently when gamete formation is occurring. And both of these laws pretty much govern how traits are passed for just about any gene, and so they ended up being a very important predictive tool for genetics. If you want to follow a trait through several generations, a lot of times you'll use something called a pedigree. A pedigree is a family history that shows how a trait is inherited through several generations. So this only shows genetic relationships. But what we have on the right-hand side of the screen here is a pedigree, and there's a few things that you should know. When you're looking at a pedigree, it's important to know that the square individuals, so these people here, are males, and then the circles are females. And if you're looking at a specific trait, the people who have the trait are going to be shaded in. So like in our example, the people shaded in are the people who are affected with whatever it is that this trait is. This happens to show an X-linked recessive trait, so perhaps the two men who are shaded in here are colorblind. You might also notice there are lines. Sometimes if there's a line drawn between a circle and a square, it means that those two people had children, and then their children are shown on these vertical lines. So if there's a line that drops down and then continues to another person, that's one of their children. So you can see that these individuals, and so we can call them Roman numeral 1-1 and Roman numeral 1-2, had 3 children, and those people are represented by Roman numeral 2-2, 2-3, and 2-5. There's a lot more symbols that are used in pedigrees. The most important are that they're affected or unaffected, or if we know someone's heterozygous, you can shade them halfway in. That means that they're a carrier of a normal trait. If they're a circle with a dot in it, then they're an X-linked carrier. And if someone has a line through them, like here, it means they're deceased. So there's lots of different symbols, but those are probably the most important ones. If you see a pedigree for an autosomal dominant trait, it means that the person who has at least one allele will show the trait. So when you look at a pedigree for an autosomal dominant trait, you'll oftentimes see the trait in all the generations. And every single person who has the trait has a parent who shows the trait. And so that way, you know that this trait is dominant and has been passed down through generations and is always visible in each generation. In a recessive trait, you might not see the trait present in every generation, but there will always be carriers in every generation. So in this example, you can see this person has this trait. Neither of their parents have the trait that's visible, but you'll notice because they're half shaded in, both of those people are carriers for this trait. And they both come from families who have parents who are also carriers. So they are also not going to show whatever this trait is, but they definitely carry it because that's how it got passed down to this individual. X-linked dominant traits end up looking a lot like regular dominant traits because they can be present equally in men and women or anybody who has an X chromosome, because you only need one copy of the X chromosome in order for these traits to be expressed. The only difference is that females can only pass this trait, or can pass this trait to both males and females, because females can only pass on X chromosomes. Fathers will only pass this trait to daughters, and then they pass Y chromosomes to people who are born male. X-linked recessive traits are always present in people with the XY chromosome, so that's what you see here. They, however, are not always present or visible in females who are carriers. So if you have two X chromosomes, you could be heterozygous for this trait, and it's not visible because it's recessive. So fathers will always pass this trait on to their daughters to carry, but never their sons. Pedigrees are useful to people because they can predict the passage of disease through families. And so, like, if someone knows that there's a hereditary disease in their family, like Tay-Sachs disease or Huntington's disease, pedigrees can help them kind of assess risk that they're going to pass diseases like that on to their children.